2003, inside the FBI's high-security lab, the nation's top forensics team began their analysis of a brutal crime. They were the best at finding answers in the silence of the dead. But by morning, the lab was sealed, and the entire team was gone. 22 years later, a rookie agent tasked with closing the file for good finds a single terrified message scribbled in a margin, revealing the truth was never lost. It was locked inside with them. The digital clock on the sterile white wall of the records annex flipped to 12 a.m. Agent Riley Sloan was alone, a fact amplified by the oppressive humming silence of the climate control systems. This was his domain, a purgatory of forgotten cases and dusty binders stacked floor to ceiling. He had been assigned to the decommissioning of old case files, a task more suited to a librarian than a field agent. The assignment felt like a punishment, a subtle reminder of his overeager reputation. He had been promoted from cold case review, but this felt like a step backward, a quiet exile among the ghosts of investigations long since gone cold. His supervisor, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a state of weary disappointment, had handed him the list with a simple instruction. Just box them, Sloan. Don't read them, don't analyze them. Just confirm, seal, and transport. But Sloan couldn't help himself. It wasn't in his nature. The instinct that got him labeled a chaser of phantoms in his youth was the same one that now made his skin prickle under the artificial lighting. He ran a hand over his short-cropped hair, his eyes scanning the list until they landed on the final entry for the night. Case file #V77B03. The file designation was unusual, a deviation from standard FBI classification. The FIV stood for vanished, a grim category reserved for cases where bureau personnel themselves were the victims of a disappearance. Sloan felt a familiar, unwelcome knot tighten in his stomach. It was the pull of the abyss, the call of a story without an ending. He navigated the narrow aisles, the wheels of his cart squeaking a lonely protest. The air grew cooler as he moved deeper into the archives, the scent of old paper and decaying cardboard thick in his throat. He found the designated shelf in the farthest corner of the room, a place where the hum of the lights seemed to fade into a deeper, more profound silence. The box was there, just as the manifest described. It was a standard-issue records container, but it felt different. It was sealed, not with standard evidence tape, but with a thick, waxy red band he had never seen before. An embossed stamp was pressed into the wax, a symbol of a locked door overlaid with a question mark. It was a seal of finality, a warning. Sloan carefully lifted the box from the shelf. It was heavier than he expected, a dead weight that seemed to carry the gravity of its contents. He placed it on his cart and wheeled it back to the single illuminated desk in the center of the vast, dark room. The journey felt like a procession. For a long moment, he just stared at the red seal. Breaking it felt like a violation, a transgression against an order handed down from a time before he had even dreamed of joining the bureau. He thought of his supervisor's warning, the weary look in his eyes. He thought of his own past, of the teachers who had told him to stop looking for patterns where there were none. With a deep breath, he took the small utility knife from his desk. The blade sliced through the wax with a soft, sucking sound. The seal fell away in 2 clean pieces, revealing the simple cardboard flaps beneath. It felt anticlimactic, yet his heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He lifted the lid. The first thing that hit him was the smell. It was not the musty scent of old paper he was accustomed to. It was a sharp, sterile chemical odor, faint but unmistakable, like the ghost of a clean room. It was the smell of a laboratory. Inside, the contents were perfectly organized. The primary folder was thick, bound with a heavy-duty clip. On its cover, typed in stark, block capitals, were the words, Homicide, John T. Reynolds. Evidence Processing Log, November 14th, 2003. Team Delta. Below that, a handwritten note in red ink had been added. File sealed, November 15th, 2003, 0800 HRS. No further entries. By order of Director Harrison. Director Harrison, Sloan's blood ran cold. He was a legend, a hard-nosed figure from the Bureau's old guard who had retired over a decade ago. For a sitting director to personally order a single case file sealed was unheard of. It spoke of a significance that transcended a simple homicide investigation. He opened the folder, his fingers tracing the edge of the first page. It was a standard chain of custody form for the evidence from the Reynolds homicide. Everything was meticulously documented. The victim's clothing, shell casings, fiber samples. He could see the signatures of the forensics team, 5 of them in total, as they checked the items into the lab. He knew their names. Dr. Alistair Finch, the team lead, a pioneer in trace evidence analysis. Eva Rostova, a stoic geneticist from Russia who could map a person's life from a single strand of hair. Young Marcus Thorne, the toxicology prodigy. And the 2 quiet workhorses, Ben Carter and Maria Flores, specialists in ballistics and latent prints. They were the best of the best, a squad of forensic celebrities. They had walked into Secure Evidence Lab 4 at 9 a.m. on November 14, 2003 to process the evidence. The logs showed them entering, one by one, but there was no record of them ever leaving. When the morning shift arrived, the lab was locked from the inside. No response to calls, no answer on the intercom. The official story, the one whispered in the hallways at Quantico, was a catastrophic chemical spill. A new experimental solvent for lifting DNA had supposedly become airborne, a silent, lethal poison that left no trace. The bodies were never recovered because, as the story went, there was nothing left to recover. The lab was permanently sealed, a tomb for 5 of the Bureau's brightest minds. Sloan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. It was a story that had always felt too neat, too clean. The Bureau didn't just lose its top forensic team and seal a lab without a mountain of paperwork and a dozen independent inquiries. Yet this file, the single definitive record of that day, was thinner than it should have been. He turned the pages slowly, deliberately. He absorbed the details of the Reynolds homicide, trying to see what they had seen. It was a standard mob hit, professionally done. Nothing that would seem to require the intervention of a ghost chemical or a directorial cover-up. It was just a case. He moved past the initial evidence manifests and into the preliminary analysis reports. The handwriting was crisp, professional. Finch's familiar, spidery script detailed the trace fibers found on the victim. Rostova's notes on blood spatter were precise, almost mathematical. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. And that was what was so deeply, profoundly wrong. There was no hint of alarm, no mention of any unusual circumstances within the lab itself. The case file was a perfect snapshot of a forensic team doing its job with unparalleled efficiency, right up until the moment they apparently ceased to exist. Sloan leaned back in his chair, the squeak echoing in the cavernous room. The fluorescent light above him flickered once, twice, casting long, dancing shadows that made the stacks of shelves seem to lean inward. He was no longer just an archivist. He was the first person to look into this tomb in 22 years. He felt the weight of those 2 decades pressing down on him. The world had moved on. The FBI had new technologies, new agents, new monsters to chase. But in this box, it was still November 14th, 2003. And in this room, with the silence of the archives as his only witness, Sloan felt the first stirrings of an old, familiar obsession. He was not just going to seal this box. He was going to open it. The scent of the lab, faint as it was, clung to the paper, a chemical ghost that Sloan could almost taste. He pushed aside the primary case file on the Reynolds homicide, his focus shifting to the secondary binders tucked underneath. These were the operational logs for Secure Evidence Lab 4 itself. They were the key, the objective record of the lab's internal environment. There were 3 of them, each one thick and heavy. The first was the access log. Sloan opened it, his eyes scanning the neat columns. He saw the 5 members of Team Delta sign in one after another between 8:52 a.m. and 8:59 a.m. Their signatures were firm, confident, nothing amiss. He flipped through the subsequent pages, expecting to see entries from the response team, the Hazmat crews, the director himself. But there was nothing. The entry log simply stopped after Marcus Thorne's signature. The rest of the book, hundreds of pages, was completely blank. This was the first crack in the official narrative. A sealed lab, a potential biohazard, and no one from the responding teams logged their entry. It was a procedural impossibility. Every single person entering a secure FBI facility, especially under emergency circumstances, was required to sign in. The absence of signatures was not an oversight. It was a deliberate omission. It meant the official response either never happened or someone wanted it to look like it never happened. Sloan felt his pulse quicken. This was no longer just a feeling. This was evidence of a cover-up. He set the access log aside and picked up the second binder, the equipment usage log. This was where the team would have documented every piece of machinery they used, from the mass spectrometer to the fuming hoods. He opened it to the date in question. The entries began at 9:05 a.m., penned in the meticulous, blocky printing of Ben Carter, the ballistics expert who also served as the team's unofficial clerk. Carter had noted the activation of the primary ventilation system. He logged the unsealing of the evidence containers from the Reynolds case. Sloan followed the timeline, his finger tracing the entries. 9:30 a.m. mass spectrometer powered on for calibration. 9:45 a.m. gas chromatograph initialized. 10 a.m. DNA sequencer begins preliminary run. It was a symphony of scientific precision. Each step logged, timed, and initialed. The entries continued, a steady rhythm of work. 10:15 a.m. First fiber sample from victim's jacket entered into spectrometer. Initialed AAF for Alistair Finch. 10:22 a.m. Latent prints from shell casing being fumed. Initialed AMF for Maria Flores. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. Then he turned the page. The entry at the top was timed at 10:29 a.m. It read switching to secondary air filtration system for solvent test sequence Gamma 7. It was initialed by Marcus Thorne, the toxicology prodigy. Sloan paused. He had read the Reynolds case file cover to cover. There was no mention of any solvent test sequence Gamma 7. It wasn't part of the homicide investigation's protocol. It was something else entirely. Something unscheduled. He looked at the next line. The time was 10:32 a.m. The entry was a single, shaky word. Pressure. The rest of the line was blank. The ink trailed off, as if the pen had been dragged away from the page. And that was it, the final entry in the equipment log. Just like the access log, it simply stopped. The dozens of pages that followed were pristine, untouched. The symphony had been cut short, mid-note. Sloan leaned back. The image of that trailing ink burned into his mind. Pressure. What did it mean? A change in air pressure, or the pressure of a sudden terrible event? The shaky handwriting, so different from the crisp entries before it, told its own story. It spoke of haste, of alarm. He reached for the third and final binder. It was labeled Chemical Inventory and Disposal Log. This would list every compound stored in the lab and every ounce that was used or disposed of. If there was a catastrophic chemical spill, the evidence would be here. He flipped it open. The inventory was vast. Hundreds of chemicals, reagents, and solvents were listed in alphabetical order, their quantities noted in precise measurements. He searched for anything unusual, anything that could be weaponized or could account for a silent, traceless killer. He found the standard array of lab chemicals: ninhydrin, luminol, acetone, methanol. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He turned to the disposal section, to the logs for November 14, 2003. According to the official story, this section should have detailed the use of a new experimental solvent, but there was no such entry. The page for that day was completely blank. This was more than a red flag. It was a blaring siren. The official explanation for the team's disappearance, the accidental release of an experimental chemical, was a lie. There was no record of any such chemical in the lab's inventory. There was no record of it being used or disposed of. Sloan stood up and began to pace the small area around his desk. The silence of the archives felt different now. It was no longer just quiet. It was watchful. He felt like he was being observed, not by a person, but by the weight of the secret he was slowly uncovering. The story was a fabrication. A high-level, officially sanctioned fabrication ordered by the director himself. The team didn't vanish because of an accident. They vanished because of something that happened at 10:29 a.m., something involving a secret test sequence and a sudden change in pressure. He went back to the equipment log, to the final haunting entry, switching to secondary air filtration system for solvent test sequence Gamma 7. Why switch the air filtration? Standard procedure for dealing with a volatile chemical was to use the main high-capacity fume hoods and the primary ventilation, which exhausted directly outside the building. Switching to a secondary, closed-loop filtration system was counterintuitive, unless they didn't want whatever they were working with to leave the room. They were trying to contain something, not protect themselves from it. Sloan sat back down, his mind racing. He was trained to find patterns to connect dots that others overlooked. It was the very instinct that had gotten him into trouble, the tendency to build theories from whispers and shadows. But this was different. This wasn't a whisper. This was a scream, written in the blank pages of 3 official logbooks. He felt a sudden professional clarity. He was no longer just satisfying his own curiosity. He was conducting an investigation. His first subject was not a person, but a narrative. The official story of case file #V77B03, and his investigation had just proven that the narrative was a lie. He carefully placed the logbooks back into the heavy cardboard box. He looked at the main case file, the one detailing the mob hit of John T. Reynolds. That case was a distraction, a piece of stage dressing designed to look important while the real drama unfolded behind the scenes. The team hadn't been processing a homicide. They had been conducting a secret experiment. The question was, what was solvent Gamma 7? And what happened when the pressure changed? He knew the answer wasn't in the logs. The logs were a record of what was missing. To find the truth, he would have to look closer at what was there. He would have to re-examine every page of the team's final notes, looking for a clue that everyone else had missed for 22 years. He picked up the primary case file again, its weight feeling different now. It was no longer just the story of a murder. It was the last will and testament of 5 vanished scientists. And somewhere in its pages, he was certain, they had left a message. The sterile scent of the file seemed stronger now, as if opening the logs had released a more potent concentration of the lab's ghostly atmosphere. Sloan pushed the logbooks to the side, his entire focus converging on the main forensic report. He had dismissed it earlier as window dressing for the real mystery, but now he saw it differently. If the team knew they were in danger, if they suspected something was wrong with the secret test they were conducting, they wouldn't have documented it in the official logs. They would have hidden it. He began to read the report again, but this time he wasn't reading for content. He was looking for anomalies. A change in handwriting, a misplaced comma, an out-of-place smudge of ink. He was hunting for a whisper in a sea of procedural text. His eyes scanned Dr. Finch's analysis of the trace evidence. The language was dense, technical, describing microscopic fibers and particulate matter with detached scientific precision. Sloan forced himself to slow down, to examine not just the words, but the space between them. He held the pages up to the light, tilting them, searching for any indentation or alteration. Nothing. Page after page of routine analysis. He moved on to the ballistics report from Ben Carter. It was a dry, factual account of shell casing striations and firing pin impressions. The work was immaculate, the conclusions clear. Carter had identified the murder weapon with his usual certainty. Then came Maria Flores' section on latent fingerprints. She had lifted a partial print from the victim's car door, a smudge that was almost useless. Her notes detailed the painstaking process of using cyanoacrylate fuming to make the print visible. Her handwriting was a graceful looping cursive, a stark contrast to the blocky print of her colleagues. Sloan felt a flicker of frustration. He was chasing ghosts again, wasn't he? He was looking for a secret message in a mundane report, letting his imagination run away with him. The blank logs were suspicious, yes, but perhaps there was another explanation. Maybe the protocol for a Gamma 7 test demanded secrecy, demanded blank logs. He was about to dismiss the thought, to close the file and accept that he had hit a dead end, when his finger brushed against a section of Flores' report. It was the final page of her analysis, where she concluded that the partial print was too degraded for a positive match. The paper felt slightly different there, a subtle roughness in the bottom right corner, near the page number. He brought the page closer to the desk lamp, his breath held tight in his chest. At first he saw nothing, just the typed text of the report, Flores' signature, and the faint, grainy texture of the 22-year-old paper. But as he angled it just right, the light caught it, a series of impossibly faint lines in the margin. It wasn't ink, it was pencil, applied with such a light touch that it had barely bonded with the paper fibers. It looked more like a series of accidental smudges than a deliberate message. Sloane's heart began to hammer against his ribs. This was it. He needed magnification. He rummaged through his desk drawer, his hands clumsy with a sudden surge of adrenaline. He found a small, cheap magnifying glass he used for examining old microfilm, its lens smudged with fingerprints. He quickly wiped it clean on his shirt and held it over the faint markings. Under the lens, the smudges resolved into letters. They were tiny, cramped, and written in a shaky hand. It was a single sentence squeezed into the narrow space of the margin. Sloane had to squint, moving the glass back and forth to bring the words into focus. "They're testing it on us." The words hit Sloane with the force of a physical blow. He dropped the magnifying glass, which clattered onto the desk. He read the sentence again, this time without the lens, the words now seared into his memory. "They're testing it on us." It wasn't a chemical spill. It wasn't an accident. It was an experiment. An experiment where the forensic team, the 5 elite scientists in a locked lab, were the guinea pigs. The full horror of the situation began to dawn on him. Director Harrison's seal, the missing log entries, the secret Gamma-7 test. It was a planned event. Sloane's mind reeled. Who were they? And what was it? The note was terrifying, but it raised more questions than it answered. He scanned the rest of the page, his eyes darting back and forth, desperate for more, and then he saw it. Below the first sentence, almost lost in the shadow of the binder clip, was a second line of text. It was even fainter than the first. He picked up the magnifying glass again, his hand trembling slightly. He positioned it over the new set of markings. 3 words. Not the sample. His blood ran cold. He looked back at the first line. "They're testing it on us." Then the second. Not the sample. His mind put it together. The team had walked into that lab believing they were analyzing evidence from a homicide. But the real test wasn't on the fibers or the bloodstains from the Reynolds case. The real test was on the team itself. The Reynolds case was a Trojan horse, a pretext to get them into the lab and lock the door behind them. But what was the test? Solvent Test Sequence Gamma-7, Thorne had written. A solvent, something designed to dissolve, to break down, to erase. Sloane shuddered, the official story of a chemical that left no trace taking on a new, more sinister meaning. It wasn't an accident. It was the weapon's intended purpose. He felt a profound sense of violation, of trespassing on sacred ground. This note was not meant for him. It was a final, desperate message from Maria Flores, a last testament scribbled in the margins of a report as her world dissolved around her. She must have known in those final moments that no one was coming to help. She must have known that the logs would be erased, the story rewritten. But she had gambled on the paper. She had gambled that this file, her last piece of work, would survive, that someday someone would look close enough to see her faint, terrified whisper. For 22 years, she had been right. The file had survived, sealed and untouched, and now her message had finally been received. Sloane sat in the silent archives, the weight of that message settling upon him. He was no longer just an investigator. He was a witness. He was the sole inheritor of a truth that had been buried for more than 2 decades. A truth that powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself, but who could he go to? The order to seal the file had come from the director's office. The conspiracy, if that's what it was, reached the highest levels of the Bureau. To bring this forward now, as a rookie agent with a history of chasing wild theories, would be professional suicide. They would bury him just as they had buried this file. He needed more. He needed something undeniable, something more concrete than a faint pencil scribble that could easily be dismissed as a smudge or a forgery. The note was the breadcrumb, the key, but he needed to find the door it unlocked. His thoughts turned to the people. The 5 scientists were gone. Director Harrison was retired, likely unreachable and unwilling to talk. But someone else must have known. The people who worked in the forensics division at the time, the colleagues of Team Delta, the supervisors who were there that day. They had lived with the official story for 22 years. Perhaps one of them had doubts. Perhaps one of them was waiting for someone to ask the right questions. He carefully closed the file, the faint pencil note now feeling like a burning coal hidden within the pages. He placed the file and the logbooks back in the box. He did not seal it. This case was no longer cold. It was active. It was his. He packed up his things, his mind already formulating a plan. He would start with the personnel files. He needed a list of everyone who worked in the forensics unit in 2003. He would find them, the retired, the relocated, the ones who remembered Team Delta. He would have to be careful to ask questions indirectly, to not reveal what he knew. He was looking for a crack in the wall of silence, another voice to corroborate Maria Flores's terrifying message. He would start with her supervisor, a man named Dr. Miles Croft. Finding Dr. Aris Miles Croft was easier than Sloan had anticipated. The former head of the FBI's Forensic Science Division was listed in the public directory, living a quiet life of retirement in a leafy suburb of Alexandria, Virginia. He had left the bureau a year after the incident, taking an early pension for reasons listed in his file as personal health. Sloan suspected the reasons were more complicated. Miles Croft had been not only Team Delta's direct supervisor, but also Alistair Finch's mentor and close friend. The loss must have been devastating. Sloan drove to Alexandria on a Saturday morning, the sky a dull, overcast gray that matched his mood. He had spent the last 2 days poring over the personnel files from 2003, creating a web of connections, a social map of the division. Everyone's reaction to the official story was a variation on the same theme: shock, grief, and a reluctant, fearful acceptance. No one had officially questioned the narrative of the chemical spill. It was as if a curtain of silence had been dropped on the entire division. Miles Croft's house was a modest, well-kept colonial. An American flag flew from the porch. Sloan walked up the brick pathway, his FBI credentials feeling heavy and fraudulent in his pocket. He wasn't here on official business. He was here on a ghost hunt, armed with a 22-year-old secret. He rang the doorbell. After a moment, the door opened, and a man who looked older than his 70 years peered out. He had thin white hair, sharp, intelligent eyes behind thick glasses, and a weariness that seemed to be etched into his bones. It was Miles Croft. Dr. Miles Croft, Sloan began, holding up his credentials. My name is Agent Riley Sloan. I apologize for disturbing you at home, but I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your time at the Bureau. Miles Croft's eyes narrowed slightly as he examined the ID. He didn't seem surprised or alarmed, merely resigned. It's been a long time since an agent has come to my door. This isn't about my taxes, is it? He asked, his voice dry and raspy. No, sir, Sloan replied. This is about a case file I'm processing for archival. Case file V77B03. The reaction was immediate and profound. The thin veil of tired pleasantry vanished from Miles Croft's face. A shudder came down in his eyes, a look of deep, ancient pain mixed with something else. Fear. He seemed to shrink in on himself, his shoulders slumping. I have nothing to say about that, Miles Croft said, his voice suddenly flat and devoid of emotion. He began to close the door. Sir, please, Sloan said, putting a hand up, not to stop the door, but as a gesture of appeal. I know the official story, the chemical spill, but the file, it doesn't add up. The logs are empty. Miles Croft froze, his hand tight on the doorknob. He stared at Sloan, his gaze intense, searching. For a moment, Sloan thought he saw a flicker of hope, a desire to speak, but it was quickly extinguished, replaced by that same guarded fear. Some things are better left in the archives. Agent Sloan, Miles Croft said, his voice low and firm. You're a young agent. You have a long career ahead of you. Don't throw it away by digging up bones that were meant to stay buried. 5 of the Bureau's best scientists are dead, sir, Sloan pressed, his own voice dropping. Alistair Finch was your friend. Don't you want to know what really happened to him? The mention of Finch's name caused a visible flinch. Miles Croft's knuckles turned white on the doorknob. I know what happened, he said, the words sounding rehearsed, brittle. It was a tragic accident. A terrible, tragic accident. The file doesn't support that, Sloan insisted. There's no record of the chemical. The disposal logs are blank. Someone fabricated the story. Miles Croft took a step back from the door, shaking his head slowly. You need to walk away from this right now. Take the file, seal the box, and forget you ever saw it. That is the best advice anyone will ever give you. Why? Sloan asked, his frustration mounting. Why is everyone so afraid to talk about this? What could possibly be worth covering up for 22 years? Miles Croft looked past Sloan, his eyes scanning the quiet suburban street, as if expecting to see threats lurking behind the manicured hedges. He looked like a man who had been living in fear for a very long time. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Miles Croft whispered, his voice raspy with a desperate urgency. This isn't about a case. It was never about the Reynolds homicide. That was just a delivery system. A delivery system for what? Sloan asked, leaning in. But the wall was back up. Miles Croft shook his head again, a look of finality on his face. I've said too much. I'm an old man, Agent. I have a family, grandchildren. I made my peace with this a long time ago. I suggest you do the same. With that, he closed the door, the click of the lock echoing in the quiet air. Sloan stood on the porch for a full minute, his mind racing. Miles Croft hadn't denied the cover-up. In fact, he had all but confirmed it. His fear was palpable, real. It was the fear of a man who knew the truth and knew the consequences of speaking it. His words echoed in Sloan's mind. A delivery system. It confirmed Sloan's theory that the Reynolds case was a Trojan horse, and the phrase digging up bones that were meant to stay buried was a clear warning. This wasn't just a secret. It was a threat. The encounter left Sloan feeling more isolated than ever, but also more determined. The resistance was proof. It meant he was on the right path. Miles Croft was a dead end, a man too frightened to help. Sloan would have to find another way. He got back in his car, the gray sky seeming to press down on him. He had one more lead from the personnel files, a long shot. Eva Rostova, the team's geneticist, had a younger brother, Nikolai, who had also worked for the Bureau in a different department, digital forensics. He had resigned 6 months after his sister's disappearance, citing family reasons. It was a tenuous link, but it was something. If anyone would be willing to defy the wall of silence, it might be a family member. Nikolai Rostova would have had not just professional curiosity, but a personal stake in the truth. Sloan pulled out his phone and began searching for him. The resistance from the old guard was forcing him to look for allies in unexpected places. The past was locked down, guarded by fear, so he would have to find his answers in the present. Nikolai Rostova was harder to find than Miles Croft. After leaving the Bureau, he had seemingly dropped off the grid, severing his government ties completely. Sloan spent a week of sleepless nights cross-referencing old employee records with public data, chasing digital breadcrumbs down a dozen dead-end paths. Finally, he found him, not through a database, but through a niche online forum dedicated to vintage data recovery. A user named Nico_R had posted a detailed solution to a complex problem involving a corrupted hard drive from the late 90s, and his profile listed his location as a small, remote town in rural Oregon. It was a long shot, but the technical expertise and the name were too much of a coincidence. Sloan didn't call. He knew a direct approach would likely be met with the same resistance he found with Miles Croft. Instead, he crafted an email under a pseudonym, posing as a freelance journalist researching a book on the evolution of FBI investigative technology. He mentioned the 2003 era and asked if Nico_R might be willing to share some general insights. To his surprise, he received a reply within hours. It was cautious, but not dismissive. "I may have some knowledge from that period," the email read. "What specifically are you interested in?" Sloan took the gamble. He replied, "I'm interested in the transition from physical to digital evidence management, specifically how scans of paper documents were handled. For example, in a high-priority case like the John T. Reynolds homicide in late 2003. The silence that followed was deafening. For 3 days, Sloan checked his inbox obsessively, the hope draining from him with each passing hour. He had overplayed his hand. He had spooked him. Then, on the 4th day, a new email appeared. It contained no text, just a single encrypted file attachment and a subject line that read, "Be careful." Sloan's hands trembled as he downloaded the file. It was locked with a formidable level of encryption, something far beyond standard commercial software. It was the work of a professional, someone who lived and breathed data security. It took Sloan another 2 days, using restricted bureau software he wasn't authorized to access, to finally crack it. His own terminal word, the decryption program running through trillions of possibilities until, finally, the file unlocked. It wasn't a document. It was a single raw image file, a TIFF scan. When he opened it, his screen filled with a high-resolution image of the very page from Maria Flores's report where he had found the pencil scribble. But this was a scan of the page as it existed before the pencil marks were added. It was a clean page. Sloan felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. Had Nikolai sent this to discredit him? To show him that the note he'd found wasn't there originally, that it must have been added later? Was this a warning that he was being set up? He stared at the clean digital image of the page, his theory crumbling around him. But then he remembered Nikolai's expertise. He wasn't a handwriting expert. He was a digital forensics specialist. He wouldn't have sent a simple image. The message wasn't in what the image showed. It was in the image file itself. Sloan's training kicked in. He wasn't looking at a picture. He was looking at a container of data. He began to analyze the file's metadata, the digital information embedded within the TIFF file that recorded its history. He found the expected data points. The date the scan was created, November 14, 2003. The model of the scanner used a high-end flatbed scanner located, he confirmed, in the administrative office, adjacent to Lab 4. The resolution, the color depth. Everything seemed standard. He was about to give up when he noticed an anomaly in the file size. For a simple, uncompressed TIFF image of a text document, it was too large. It was bloated, heavier than it should be by several megabytes. There was something else hidden in the file. Using a steganography tool, a program designed to detect hidden data within other files, he ran a deep analysis of the TIFF image. The program churned for several minutes, and then it flagged an embedded file, a file that had been cleverly concealed within the image data of the scanned page, invisible to any normal viewing software. His heart pounded. He extracted the hidden file. Its extension was one he hadn't seen in years. WAV. It was an audio file. He double-clicked the file. His speakers crackled to life. For a moment, there was only static, a low hiss that sounded like an open line, and then a voice. It was a woman's voice, panicked, whispering, the sound distorted as if she were speaking too close to the microphone. "Don't have much time," she said. Her words rushed. "He's initiated the sequence. The secondary filtration is on. Oh God, Alistair, the pressure is dropping." Sloan recognized the name. Alistair Finch. The voice had to be one of the other team members. Eva Rostova, maybe, or Maria Flores. Another voice broke in. A man's voice, tight with stress. "Just keep recording, Eva. Get it all. The solvent isn't for the Reynolds sample. It was never for the sample." Eva Rostova. It was her. Nikolai's sister. Nikolai must have found this file on the system after she disappeared and hidden it, waiting for someone to come looking. A third voice, deeper, calmer, but with an undercurrent of profound dread. It was unmistakably Dr. Alistair Finch. He called it Gamma 7, said it was a decontamination protocol, a total molecular breakdown agent. He said it would be inert in a gaseous state. He lied, Eva whispered. The sound of an alarm, a high-pitched pulsing beep, began to sound faintly in the background. The sensors are going crazy. It's not inert. It's active. There was a loud metallic clang, followed by a hiss like compressed air being released. He sealed the chamber from the control room. The second man's voice, likely Marcus Thorne or Ben Carter, said in horror, "The door controls are dead. He's locked us in." "Who?" Finch's voice demanded. "Who is in the control room?" There was a moment of silence, filled only by the escalating alarm and the soft, terrifying hiss. Then Ava Rostova's voice, clear and trembling, spoke the words that changed everything. "It's not someone in the control room," she said, her voice breaking with betrayal and disbelief. "He's in here with us. The mole. It's—" The audio cut out. A sudden sharp click, and then silence. Sloan sat frozen in his chair, the silence of his own room a stark contrast to the terror he had just heard. This was the first major twist, the one that shattered the foundation of the mystery. It wasn't just a conspiracy directed from outside. There was a sixth person in that lab, a traitor, a mole within the FBI who had been part of the team, who had sprung the trap from the inside. This recording was the undeniable proof he needed. It was a voice from the tomb, a time-stamped digital ghost that could not be dismissed or denied. Nikolai had given him the weapon he needed to blow the case wide open. He now understood the true nature of the event. It was an execution, disguised as an experiment. The mole, whose name Eva was about to speak, had lured them into a trap and activated a weapon designed to leave no trace of them or itself. But he had made one mistake. He didn't know that Eva Rostova was making a secret recording, a final message she had somehow managed to embed in a scanned document before the end. Sloan saved the audio file to a secure, encrypted drive. He now had the what, the how, and the why. The only thing missing was the who. The name of the mole was on the tip of Eva's tongue when the recording stopped. But maybe the full recording existed. This was a fragment. Where was the rest? He knew there was only one place to find the answer. He had to go to the source. He had to get inside Secure Evidence Lab 4. The lab that had been sealed for 22 years, a tomb holding the final terrible secret. Getting into Secure Evidence Lab 4 was a bureaucratic nightmare. It was still designated a Level 4 biohazard zone, despite the official story of the inert chemical. Sloan had to leverage the full, albeit limited, authority of his position. He couldn't reveal the true reason for his request, so he fabricated a plausible one. He claimed that the archival process for case file hash V77B03 required a physical audit of the sealed evidence containers listed in the original manifest, a final cross-check before the file could be permanently closed. It was a flimsy pretext, but the cogs of bureaucracy were slow and indifferent. After weeks of paperwork, formal requests, and feigning a level of pedantic dedication that his supervisors found both annoying and believable, the order was approved. A HEDSMAT-certified escort team was assigned to him. They would unseal the lab, provide him with a contamination suit, and allow him exactly 1 hour inside. The day he was scheduled to enter, the air in the FBI building felt heavy with unspoken history. The lab was located in a sub-level of the Washington field office, a section that had been closed off since the incident. The escort team, 2 grim-faced men in bulky suits, led him through corridors that grew progressively colder and more silent. They finally arrived at a heavy steel door, plastered with faded yellowing biohazard warnings. The door was sealed with a thick metal plate that had been welded to the frame. One of the escorts used a plasma cutter to slice through the welds, the screech of burning metal echoing down the empty hall. When the plate was removed, it revealed the original lab door, still intact. A small circular window, dark with grime, was set in the center. The escort leader handed Sloan a bulky, self-contained breathing apparatus and a heavy-duty contamination suit. 1 hour, Agent, the leader said, his voice tinny over the suit's intercom. We monitor your vitals from out here. Any deviation, any suit breach, and we pull you out immediately. Understood? Understood, Sloan replied, his own voice sounding distant and strange. They wrenched the door open. The hiss of equalizing pressure was loud and long, a sigh from a room that hadn't breathed in 22 years. The air that washed out was cold, dry, and carried the same faint, sterile chemical scent he remembered from the file. Sloan stepped across the threshold, and the door was sealed behind him. He was in. He was standing in the tomb. The lab was dark, the only light coming from his helmet lamp. Its beam cut a sharp, white cone through the absolute blackness. The first thing he saw was the dust. A thick, uniform layer of fine gray dust covered every surface, a silent testament to the passage of time. It was like stepping into a photograph from the past. The layout was exactly as the schematics had shown. Workstations were arranged in a U-shape around a central analysis table. The equipment was still there, hulking shapes beneath their dusty shrouds. A large mass spectrometer stood against one wall, its screen dark. A gas chromatograph sat next to it, its glass coils coated in grime. It was a ghost ship. The scene was eerily peaceful, frozen in time. A coffee mug sat on the edge of a desk, a dark residue still visible at the bottom. A pen lay next to a logbook, the same logbook he had seen in the file, its final trailing entry still visible. He was standing in the exact spot where Marcus Thorne had written the word pressure. Sloan's objective was clear. He needed to find the source of the audio recording. Eva Rostova, a digital forensics expert's sister, would have used a discreet, easily hidden device. He scanned the workstations, his light beam dancing across the dusty surfaces. He checked under keyboards, behind monitors, inside empty desk drawers. He moved to the central analysis table. This is where they would have examined the evidence from the Reynolds case. The evidence boxes were still there, neatly stacked. He checked the labels. They matched the manifest from the file perfectly. Everything was in its place. Too perfect. His light caught something out of place. Tucked behind the leg of the main table, almost completely hidden in shadow, was a single, small evidence container. It was a standard plastic box for holding biological samples, but it wasn't with the others. It looked like it had been kicked or knocked aside, coming to rest in a place no one would think to look. Sloan knelt down, his suit crinkling loudly in the silence. The container's label was smudged, but he could just make out the writing. It didn't say Reynolds, it said Gamma 7. His heart hammered in his chest. This was it. The Trojan horse, the delivery system, as Miles Croft had called it. This container hadn't held evidence. It had held the weapon. He carefully picked up the container. It was surprisingly light. He shook it gently. Nothing rattled inside. He opened the lid. It was empty. Of course, it was empty. The contents were now part of the air, the dust, the silence. But as he looked inside the empty box, his light caught a glint of something metallic at the bottom. It was a tiny wafer-thin object, no bigger than his thumbnail. It was a micro-recorder, a piece of spy tech that would have been state-of-the-art in 2003. It had been stuck to the bottom of the container with a piece of adhesive putty. Eva had hidden the recorder inside the very container that carried their doom. When the mole brought in the Gamma 7 sample, he had no idea he was also bringing in the only witness to his crime. Sloan carefully detached the recorder. It was the source, but the audio had cut out.
Why?
He examined the device closely. A tiny red light, no bigger than a pinprick, was blinking slowly. A low power indicator. The battery had died. That's why the recording stopped. But a device like this, even from 2003, would have had flash memory. The full recording, up until the moment the battery failed, should still be on it. He had it. He had the full, uncut audio. He had the name of the mole. A sudden crackle in his ear made him jump. 30 minutes remaining, Sloan, the escort's voice announced. He had what he came for, but as he stood up, his light swept across the far wall, the one behind the main workstations, and he saw something that made his blood run cold. The wall was covered in a large stainless steel panel. It was the housing for the secondary air filtration system, the one Thorne had mentioned in the log. And on its surface, etched into the dusty metal, were a series of frantic scratches. He moved closer. It was writing, scrawled with a sharp object, perhaps a letter opener or a scalpel. Finch, Rostova, Thorne, Carter, Flores, the 5 members of Team Delta. But there was a 6th name, scratched below the others, circled several times with deep, angry gouges in the metal. It was a name he recognized, a name that made no sense. It was a name from the file, but not one of the victims. It was a name that belonged to a man who was supposed to be in a prison cell in 2003, the prime suspect in the very homicide case the team was meant to be investigating. The name scratched into the wall was John T. Reynolds. The entire foundation of Sloan's theory collapsed. The victim of the mob hit, the man whose murder was the pretext for the whole event, was the mole. How was that possible? He was supposed to be dead. This was the second twist, the one that turned the whole investigation on its head. The mole wasn't a fellow agent. The conspiracy wasn't just internal. They had faked a man's death, given him a new identity, and placed him inside the FBI's most secure lab to eliminate a team of scientists. But why? What did Team Delta know that was worth such an elaborate, monstrous deception? 15 minutes, Sloan, the voice in his ear crackled, pulling him back from the brink. He had to get out. He had the recorder. He had the name. He had a truth that was infinitely more complex and terrifying than he could have ever imagined. He placed the micro-recorder into a sterile evidence bag, his mind reeling with the implications. He was walking out of this tomb with a ghost's voice and a dead man's name. Back in the sterile confines of the digital forensics lab, the silence felt different. It was no longer the oppressive quiet of the archives, but the electric hum of possibility. Sloan worked with a feverish intensity, the micro-recorder from Lab 4 sitting on his workbench like a holy relic. He had bypassed standard procedure, logging the device under a vague personal effects category to avoid immediate scrutiny. He knew that as soon as the full truth came out, his career would be the least of his worries. The device was delicate. Its power cell was completely drained, and connecting it to a modern interface without corrupting the fragile, 22-year-old flash memory was a challenge. He worked for hours, his hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He felt like a bomb disposal expert, one wrong move potentially wiping out the only pristine evidence of the crime. Finally, he established a stable connection. He initiated a data transfer, watching the progress bar crawl across his screen. The file was larger this time. The first audio file, the one from the TF image, had been just under 2 minutes long. This one was over 7. He had the whole conversation. He didn't listen to it at first. He ran the raw audio through a transcription program, wanting to see the words laid out in black and white, to analyze them without the distraction of the panicked voices and the rising alarm. The software churned, and a text document began to populate on his screen. He scrolled immediately to the end of the partial transcript he already knew, to the point where the first recording had cut off. Eva Rostova's last words had been, "He's in here with us. The mole." The new transcript picked up seamlessly. Eva Rostova, voice trembling. "It's not an agent, it's him, Reynolds." Marcus Thorne, disbelief Reynolds. "What are you talking about? He's on the slab. We have his body." Alistair Finch, dawning horror. "No, we have a body. They gave us a John Doe, switched the tags. The man we've been working on isn't John Reynolds." A new voice entered the recording. It was smooth, calm, and utterly chilling. It was a voice that held all the power in the room. "John T. Reynolds. Calmly, Dr. Finch is as always correct. You've been processing the remains of a homeless man from Baltimore, a necessary prop to get you all in the room. Ben Carter. Anger, who are you? What do you want? John T. Reynolds. Who I am is not important. Let's just say I'm a contractor, brought in to solve a problem. The problem is you, all of you. Specifically, the little side project you and Dr. Rostova have been working on." Sloan froze. A side project. What were they talking about? Alistair Finch. "I work on genomic sequencing. That's purely theoretical. It has no practical application yet." John T. Reynolds. A soft, cruel laugh. "Oh, Alistair, you're a brilliant scientist, but you are a terrible liar. Your theoretical work is much more than that. You've found it, haven't you? The thing they've been searching for 50 years. A genetic marker." Eva Rostova. "A marker for what?" We don't know what it signifies. John T. Reynolds, you're being modest, Eva. You know exactly what it signifies. A unique protein sequence that appears only in a tiny fraction of the population. A sequence that makes those individuals completely immune to mimetic agents. Sloane's mind struggled to catch up. Mimetic agents? It sounded like science fiction. He quickly opened a secure search browser on a separate terminal, typing in the term. The results were sparse, mostly from defunct, black-budget research programs from the Cold War. Mimetic agents weren't chemicals, they were concepts, information designed to spread like a virus and alter the beliefs and behaviors of anyone exposed to them. Psychological warfare on a biological level. The transcript continued. John T. Reynolds, you can't persuade them. You can't brainwash them. You can't even effectively lie to them. They're immune to suggestion, to propaganda, to fear. An entire population of people who are, for all intents and purposes, uncontrollable. And you, Dr. Finch, have found the genetic key to identifying them. Alistair Finch, we were going to publish, to submit it for peer review. The discovery belongs to the world. John T. Reynolds. And that is precisely why you are a problem that needs to be solved. Certain parties believe that information is too dangerous to be made public. It would upend the very structure of society. So, they decided to acquire your research and erase the source. Marcus Thorne, erase us. What is this stuff? The Gamma-7. John T. Reynolds, a masterpiece of nanotechnology. Not a solvent, a swarm of microscopic robots, programmed for a single task to break down organic matter at the molecular level and convert it into a simple, inert carbon dust. It will also break down themselves and the container and the recorder you think is so cleverly hidden, Eva. In 1 hour, this lab will be nothing but dust and echoes. No bodies, no evidence, no trace. A perfect, clean disappearance. Sloane felt sick. The official story wasn't just a lie. It was a perversion of a truth more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Nanotechnology, a weapon that erased its victims from existence. Alistair Finch, you won't get away with this. The research isn't just here. We have backups. John T. Reynolds, we know, and our colleagues are collecting them as we speak. Your home labs, your personal servers. By the time we're done here, it will be as if you and your little discovery never existed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a flight to catch. The primary exit sterilizer will activate in 3 minutes. It will purge my suit of any stray nanites before I leave. You, however, are already breathing them in. The transcript captured the sound of footsteps walking away, followed by the heavy clang of a door shutting. It must have been an internal service hatch. An exit that wasn't on the main lab schematics. The final minutes of the transcript were almost unbearable to read. It was the sound of the team's final moments. The alarm was screaming now. Their breathing was ragged, but they weren't panicking. They were scientists. Alistair Finch, coughing Maria, the filtration unit. Scratch our names. Scratch his name. Leave a mark, something the dust can't cover. That was the scratching Sloane had seen. A final desperate act of defiance. EVA Rostova, whispering into the recorder. The marker is real. It's on chromosome 8. We called it the Prometheus sequence. Don't let them bury it. Don't let them... Her voice trailed off, replaced by a wet, choking sound, and then silence. The recording continued for another minute, filled only with the sound of the alarm and a soft, pervasive hiss. Then, the click of the battery dying. Sloane pushed himself away from the desk, his body trembling. He now understood everything. Team Delta hadn't been eliminated because they were investigating a mobster. They were eliminated because they had made the single most important genetic discovery in human history. They had found a biological basis for incorruptibility, a gene that made people immune to manipulation. And the people who had them killed were still out there. The certain parties Reynolds worked for. The ones who had access to nanoweapons and could fake a man's death. The ones who had Director Harrison in their pocket. This conspiracy went far beyond the FBI. It was a shadow element of the government, or something more powerful still, that had been operating with impunity for decades. He had the full story now, a story that could topple governments. But it was also a story that no one would ever believe without the evidence he now possessed. The audio file was everything. He looked at the name on the screen. John T. Reynolds. A ghost. A contractor. But a ghost who had made one fatal miscalculation. He hadn't counted on the recorder's battery dying just before the nanites could destroy it. Sloan knew what he had to do. He couldn't go to his supervisor. He couldn't go to the current director. He had to go to the only body that might have the power to act on this, the only entity that was supposed to be immune to political pressure. He had to go to the office of the Inspector General. He had to blow the whistle not just on a 22-year-old cover-up, but on a conspiracy that was still very much alive. The headquarters of the Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General OIG was an imposing building of glass and steel, a modern fortress designed to project an image of unassailable integrity. Sloan felt like a man walking into a lion's den armed with nothing but a prayer. He had requested the meeting under the highest level of confidentiality, using an anonymous whistleblower channel and providing only a single sentence of context. I have direct evidence pertaining to the 2003 disappearance of FBI Forensics Team Delta. The response was swift. A meeting was set for the following morning. He was led into a secure conference room, a sterile environment with no windows and soundproofed walls. 3 people were waiting for him. A stern-looking woman with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes introduced herself as Deputy Inspector General Marion Cates. With her were a younger, intense-looking man who was the OIG's chief legal counsel, and a grizzled older man who remained silent, his hands folded on the table, observing Sloan with an unnerving stillness. "Agent Sloan," Cates began, her voice neutral, betraying no emotion. "You've made an extraordinary claim. The floor is yours. We are recording." Sloan took a deep breath. For the past 12 hours, he had rehearsed this moment, marshalling his evidence into a coherent, undeniable narrative. He started at the beginning with the sealed case file in the Midnight Archives. He spoke clearly and methodically, presenting the facts as he had discovered them, letting the evidence speak for itself. He described the blank logs, the unusual wax seal bearing Director Harrison's authority. He detailed his discovery of Maria Flora's faint pencil scribble, the first whisper of the truth. He recounted his meeting with the terrified doctor, Miles Croft, whose fearful warnings had only confirmed the existence of a cover-up. Throughout his account, the 3 figures listened without interruption. Their faces were impassive, betraying nothing. Sloan felt a growing sense of dread. Were they dismissing him? Did they think he was another crank, another conspiracy theorist? Then he played the audio. He placed the small, encrypted drive on the table and connected it to the room's secure playback system. "This is the first file," he said, "recovered from the metadata of a scanned evidence document." He played the initial 2-minute clip, the panicked voices of Eva Rostova and Alistair Finch filling the silent room. When Eva's voice named the mole as Reynolds and the audio cut out, he saw the first flicker of a reaction. The chief counsel leaned forward slightly. His eyes narrowed in concentration. "The initial theory was an internal mole," Sloan explained. "But the full audio, recovered from a micro-recorder found inside the sealed lab, reveals a far more complex reality." He paused, letting the weight of his next words hang in the air. "I gained access to Secure Lab 4 under a procedural pretext. The lab was exactly as it was left in 2003, and I found this." He played the full 7-minute audio file. The room was utterly still as the chilling conversation between the team and the man they called John T. Reynolds unfolded. The calm, cruel voice of the assassin, the revelation of the nanoweapon, the talk of a Prometheus sequence, a genetic marker for immunity to suggestion. It was all there. When the recording ended with the dying hiss and the final click, a heavy silence descended on the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Sloan could hear the blood pounding in his ears. Finally, Deputy Inspector General Cates broke the silence. Her voice was low, strained. "My God!" she whispered. She looked at Sloan, her expression of neutrality shattered, replaced by one of profound shock and gravity. "Director Harrison," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. He personally supervised the decontaminations and sealing of that lab. He signed off on the official report. The chemical spill, it was all him. The silent older man spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble. The Prometheus sequence. I've heard whispers of that project for years, assumed it was a myth, a piece of Cold War paranoia. He looked directly at Sloan, his eyes holding a new respect. It seems it was real. What you have brought us, Agent Sloan, Kate said, her voice regaining its professional steel, is the most significant and dangerous piece of intelligence this office has seen in a generation. The implications are staggering. She stood up and began to pace the room. A shadow organization with access to nanotechnology, capable of faking a mobster's death and infiltrating the FBI to assassinate its own scientists. An active cover-up orchestrated by a former director of the FBI. This isn't just a cold case. It's a clear and present threat to the security of this nation. The chief counsel spoke next, his voice sharp and focused. The audio is a bombshell, but we need to corroborate. We need to find John T. Reynolds, or whatever his real name is. We need to find the parties he worked for. And we need to secure the original research, Cates added. Finch said they had backups. His home, Rostova's apartment. They were likely seized in 2003 under some false pretense. Those files may still exist in an evidence locker somewhere, mislabeled and forgotten. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. It was no longer an interview. It was a war council. Sloan, who had walked in as a lone rogue agent, was now the key witness in the most important investigation of their lifetimes. Cates turned back to Sloan. You have taken an immense personal and professional risk, Agent. From this moment on, you are under the protection of the Inspector General's office. You will work directly with us to build this case. Your access to FBI records will be unrestricted, but covert. You are our man on the inside. It was a validation more profound than Sloan could have ever imagined. The ghosts he had been chasing were real, and now he was no longer hunting them alone. The official records will have to be amended, Cates stated, a look of grim determination on her face. But we have to do this carefully. We don't know how deep this rot goes. The people behind this are still out there. They have had 22 years to solidify their power. She looked at the encrypted drive on the table. This recording changes history. It proves that 5 of the Bureau's finest weren't victims of an accident. They were heroes who died protecting a truth that others were willing to kill for. The process had begun. The heavy machinery of justice, slow and ponderous, was beginning to turn. The first step was to discreetly reopen the investigation into the deaths of Team Delta, this time as a multiple homicide. The second was to launch a clandestine search for any surviving research related to the Prometheus sequence. The third, and most dangerous, was to begin the hunt for a man who had been a ghost for 22 years. The buried truth was finally seeing the light, and the fallout was about to begin. The OIG's investigation moved with the quiet, inexorable force of a glacier. While the public story remained unchanged, behind the scenes, a secret war was being waged. Cates and her team began a discreet audit of all evidence seized in the weeks surrounding the 2003 incident. They were looking for the backups Alistair Finch had mentioned, files and hard drives likely logged under false pretenses and buried in the vast FBI evidence warehouse in Virginia. Sloan's role shifted. He was no longer an archivist, but a ghost, working from a secure, isolated office within the OIG, sifting through 2 decades of personnel files, financial records, and communication logs. He was hunting for the tendrils of the conspiracy, looking for any connection, however faint, between former Director Harrison, the phantom John T. Reynolds, and the powerful, unnamed figures Reynolds had alluded to. The work was slow, painstaking, and dangerous. Every query he ran in the system risked tripping a silent alarm, alerting the very people he was hunting. The first tremor of the impending earthquake came when the OIG officially amended the cause of death for the members of Team Delta. In a sealed internal document, accidental chemical exposure was struck out and replaced with homicide by unknown parties. It was a bureaucratic change, hidden from public view, but its impact within the intelligence community was immediate. It sent a signal that the old story was no longer holding, and it meant the families had to be notified. For 22 years, the relatives of Finch, Rostova, Thorne, Carter, and Flores had lived with the grief of a tragic accident. Now, they were being told it was a lie. They were being told their loved ones had been murdered, and the FBI had covered it up. Deputy Inspector General Cates decided that Sloan should be present for the notifications. "You uncovered the truth," she told him, her expression grim. "You carry the weight of it. You owe it to them to be there when that weight is shifted." The first meeting was with Elodie Finch, Dr. Alistair Finch's widow. She was a frail, elegant woman in her late 70s, with the same sharp, intelligent eyes as her late husband. They met her in the same quiet suburban home she had shared with him, a house filled with books and memories. When Cates carefully, gently explained the new findings, Elodie listened with a profound, unshakable stillness. The color drained from her face, but she did not weep. She simply nodded, as if a suspicion she had harbored for 2 decades was finally being confirmed. "I never believed it was an accident," she said, her voice thin but steady. "Alistair was the most careful man I have ever known. He was meticulous. He would never have allowed an accident like that to happen." She looked at Sloan, her gaze piercing. He had become secretive. In the months before he died, he called it his Prometheus's work. He said it was something that could change the world, make it better. He also said there were people who would do anything to stop him. Her words sent a chill down Sloan's spine. The team knew they were in danger long before they walked into Lab 4. "He told me that if anything ever happened to him," Elodie continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, "the key was with the brother. That's all he would say." "The brother?" Cates asked, leaning forward. Sloan's mind raced. "Nikolai Rostova," he said aloud. "Eva Rostova's brother, the one who sent me the first audio file." It was Nikolai who held the key. He hadn't just given Sloan a clue, he had been entrusted with the legacy of the entire project. The OIG immediately dispatched a protected team to Oregon. The meeting with Marcus Thorne's parents was different. They were bitter, angry people, their grief having curdled over the years into a deep resentment of the Bureau. They lashed out, accusing Cates and Sloan of incompetence, of reopening old wounds for no reason. "So you're telling us now he was murdered?" Mr. Thorne shouted, his face red with fury. "Where were you for 22 years? You let our son's killers walk free." Sloan could only sit there and absorb their rage, knowing it was justified. He was the face of the institution that had failed them so profoundly. The meeting ended with slammed doors and threats of lawsuits. The fallout was spreading, turning grief into anger. The most difficult notification was a video call to a military base in Germany. Major Ben Carter, Jr. The son of ballistics expert Ben Carter was a decorated officer who had been only 10 years old when his father disappeared. He listened to Cates's explanation with the disciplined calm of a soldier, his face a mask of control. When she was finished, he was silent for a long moment. "My father was a patriot," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "He believed in the Bureau. He believed in the mission. To know that the institution he gave his life for lied to us, that is a difficult thing to accept." He looked directly into the camera, his eyes locking onto Sloan's. "The man who did this Reynolds, is he alive?" "We believe so, Major," Sloan answered, honestly. "Then find him," Carter Jr. said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "That's all the justice we need. Find him." The meetings left Sloan emotionally raw. The case was no longer an abstract puzzle, a file in a box. It was a tapestry of ruined lives, of families broken by a single horrific act and the decades of lies that followed. It fueled his resolve, hardening his determination into a cold, sharp point. The pressure was mounting. News of the reclassification had leaked to a few trusted journalists, and whispers were starting to circulate in Washington. The official story was crumbling. The families were demanding answers, threatening to go public. The shadow organization that had orchestrated the cover-up would know that their secret was unraveling. They would not remain idle. Sloan felt like he was in a race against time. The investigation had to move faster. He redoubled his efforts, diving deeper into the digital archives, searching for any trace of the ghost named Reynolds. He owed it to Elodie Finch, to the Thorns, to Major Carter. He owed it to the 5 heroes who had died in a dusty lab, scratching a final message of defiance into a metal wall. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Following the lead from Elodie Finch, the OIG team in Oregon had located Nikolai Rostova. He had been living under a new name, working as a freelance data security consultant. He had been waiting for 22 years. The key Alistair Finch had mentioned wasn't another audio file. It was a complete encrypted copy of all their research into the Prometheus sequence. But it was also something more. Nikolai had a piece of information he had held back, a final, secret failsafe. His sister Eva had been deeply paranoid about their research being stolen. She had tagged a single innocuous file in their data package with a nearly undetectable digital tracker, a piece of code that would ping its location once a year if the file was ever accessed. For 21 years, there had been silence. But 9 months ago, it had pinged. The file had been opened on a secure server traced to a private defense contractor named Ethelred Group. The contractor's main client was a clandestine multi-agency intelligence fusion center within the Department of Defense. This was the Shadow Organization. This was the entity that Reynolds worked for. Armed with this information, the OIG's power became absolute. They obtained sealed warrants, and in a series of coordinated pre-dawn raids, they descended on Ethelred Group's headquarters and the associated DoD Fusion Center. The evidence they seized was overwhelming. They found the stolen research. They found financial records detailing payments to a shell corporation used by a single untraceable operative, and they found the operative's true name. John T. Reynolds was a fiction. The man's real name was Kalen Rourke, a former CIA Special Activities Division operator who had been officially listed as killed in action in 2001. He was a professional ghost. The raids also implicated 2 high-ranking officials within the DoD and a retired Undersecretary of State, all of whom had overseen the illegal program. And they found evidence that former FBI Director Harrison had been blackmailed into compliance, his career threatened by a past indiscretion the Shadow Group had uncovered. The dam of secrecy broke. The arrests were swift and silent, the scandal contained at the highest levels to prevent a catastrophic loss of public faith in the government itself. The story that was eventually released to the public was carefully managed, but the core truth was there. Team Delta had been murdered by a rogue intelligence faction to suppress a world-changing discovery. They were officially declared heroes. Sloan watched the news reports from his small, temporary office. He saw the solemn faces of government officials promising transparency and justice. He saw the faces of the families, their expressions a mixture of vindication, pain, and profound loss. His work was done. The truth was out. He found himself back where it all started, standing in the midnight silence of the FBI archives. The V77B03 box sat on his desk, no longer sealed, its contents now part of the official, amended history. He looked around at the towering shelves, at the millions of stories waiting in the dark. He had pulled one file from the abyss, and it had shaken the foundations of power. He thought about his own past, about the high school teachers and early supervisors who had dismissed him as a daydreamer, a chaser of ghosts. They saw his obsession with unanswered questions as a weakness, a lack of focus. They had been wrong. That instinct, that refusal to accept a story that didn't make sense, was the single most important tool he possessed. It had allowed him to hear Maria Flores's faint pencil scribble, to see the truth in the blank pages of a logbook. His victory felt strangely hollow. The guilty were being brought to justice, but Team Delta was still gone. Their brilliant minds, their potential, had been turned to dust by a weapon born of fear. The world they had tried to create, one where the truth had a biological imperative, was still a distant dream. The Prometheus sequence research was now classified at a level so high it might as well not exist. The very people Finch feared had ended up controlling his discovery. But it wasn't a total loss. The truth was known. The families had their answers, and a secret, cancerous growth within the government had been excised. It was not the clean, perfect victory of a movie, but the messy, complicated reality of justice. He picked up the file, the real file, its pages filled with the OIG reports, the transcripts, the warrants. He carried it to its final resting place in the archives, placing it on the shelf not as a cold case, but as a closed one. A story with a beginning, a middle, and now an end. As he walked out of the archives, switching off the light and plunging the room back into darkness, he felt a sense of quiet resolve. The world was full of locked rooms and buried secrets. Most people walked past them, content with the official story. But some, the ones who couldn't ignore the silence that felt too loud or the story that felt too neat, were compelled to stop and listen. They were the keepers of the questions, the chasers of ghosts. Sloane now knew with absolute certainty that this was who he was. He wasn't just an archivist or an agent. He was a listener, and he knew, as he stepped out into the early morning light, that this case was not the end of his journey. It was the beginning. There were other files, other whispers waiting in the silence, and he was ready to hear them.